Hello and good morning. This is Kelsey from Kels Reads Things at Anna Porter Public Library in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And today I am very excited to be discussing with you Sorcery of Thorns. This is a young adult fantasy book that follows the life of 16-year-old Elizabeth Scribner, who is in training as an apprentice to be a librarian in one of the great libraries of Ostamere. This is also based in the 19th century with definitely a fantastical theme, magic, and all kinds of other dark elements can be found in this book. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little more of an in-depth idea of the plot of Sorcery of Thorns and kind of what is going on in this story. Elizabeth Scribner is a 16-year-old library apprentice at Summershaw, which is a branch of the great libraries in 19th century Ostamere. And unfortunately, she somehow cannot seem to keep herself out of trouble. She's grown up as an orphan alongside conscious, mischievous grimoires, and it is her and her fellow librarians' duty to keep these chaotic and even dangerous books safe while also in control. Elizabeth knows that sorcerers are evil, and even grimoires can get out of hand. These are two truths that she was raised to believe as a library apprentice. It was her duty to keep magic in control. However, when an unexpected sabotage unleashes Summershaw's most vicious grimoire, Elizabeth finds herself wrongly accused of the crime that she did not commit. She must then rely on the untrustworthy, famous, and very handsome sorcerer Nathaniel Thorn and his demon servant Silas in order to help clear her name. As the stakes grow higher, Elizabeth finds herself caught in the middle of a centuries-old conspiracy, and it might just be up to her and her growing ties to Nathaniel in order to save the world. Okay, so that was the general plot point of Sorcery of Thorns. It is an excellent introduction, I believe, to young adult fantasy, as it wasn't exceptionally advanced in terms of grammar, plotline, or even necessarily situations. I would say that it's definitely an acceptable young adult novel for most readers to read. Again, it is never, ever my job to tell you or your child what they should read. I just like to give a general idea of guidelines. If anything, I would say that this book is maybe PG-13, even potentially PG. So if you have any kind of hesitation before, please don't feel that way, as this was a wonderful book and most readers, I think, would enjoy it. Before I discuss the things that I really enjoyed about this book, I'd like to go ahead and just inform my followers of a few triggers that they might want to be aware of before they start this book. This is based in the 19th century, so of course some problems that were present, and especially social problems that were present at that time, are represented in this book, including distrusting of women, diagnosing women with hysteria, or, yes, is it hysteria? Hysteria. Hysteria. Yes, diagnosing women with hysteria for, just having emotions and being normal people and experiencing stress. So that was annoying. And I believe there isn't really any other necessarily strong trigger. It was mostly just a really fun, strongly plot-driven fantasy book. There was quite a bit of adventure in it as well, and that was something that I really enjoyed in general about the book. The storyline was clear, the protagonist was relatable, and everything was relatively easy to follow. And also, the storyline was very unique. It was a great take on young adult fantasy, and it was something that was new, so it kept me invested. I mean, how can you beat a magical library with magical books? Training as a librarian to not only protect these books, but to defend other people from them? that kind of sounds like the best of both worlds, in my opinion. So Elizabeth was training to be a warden, technically. She was a library apprentice, and eventually she would have chosen a pathway, and she was in the process of becoming a warden. And wardens are the protectors of the libraries. They're the ones who come to the aid in case things go wrong. The time period, as I've mentioned, was a Victorian, a 19th century setting. It was definitely clear that the general setting was like a London, United Kingdom area. It was very gothic and almost steampunk-ish. Definitely kind of had that Sherlock Holmes sort of style of gothic Victorian, and I love that time period. I love reading about it, and I love all the gothicness and the dark fashion pieces of that time. So I think they did a really good job of expressing the imagery. There was a lot of really well done descriptions of the settings and the imagery, the clothes. I thought the author did a really good job of ensuring that the reader is aware of the time period and the place that all of these events are taking place at. I love libraries, obviously. So any book about a library, especially one with conscious books, is going to grip my attention. It was a unique story. I loved the extra elements of mystery and darkness to the tone of the story. They worked really, really well together. As I kind of touched on previously, there was a healthy balance of past threats, such as, doctors not taking women seriously, the threat of mental hospitals, and we all know that mental hospitals back in the time was not for the benefit of the patrons. There was also, again, the threats in a fantastical world. I believe I mentioned in my plot explanation that there are sorcerers in this book, and sorcerers become sorcerers. I believe it's mostly by family ties, but a lot of it occurs when a person devotes part of their life, I believe it is, to a demon. And then the demon gives them all of their source of power. And demons typically are kind of like one of those things that people know about, but they don't speak about them. Kind of like a social taboo at the time. So in order for sorcerers to have their demons with them when they go out and about, they transform into something else. For instance, Silas, who is Nathaniel Thorn's demon, would transform into a cat whenever he was with him in public. I loved every single character. They were all extremely fleshed out, really thought about, and all extremely individual. So that is something that I always hope for when I'm reading new books, and I was happy to find that in this case. And I'll discuss the characters a little more in depth. From now, I'm going to just continue to highlight the things that I liked about the book. The comedic moments in this series are what made the book for me. There were so many moments when it was either ironic humor, sarcastic humor, dry humor. It killed me. It made me laugh so hard. So that was something that was really nice to see, is even though there is a little bit of dark elements to this fantasy, that there's also some fun. So I listened to the audiobook of this book. I didn't actually read it. However, I really enjoyed it. I think the narrator did a fantastic job. She really was able to find a voice for a 16-year-old naive girl. Spunky, but again, naive, and I think she just did an excellent job not only performing Elizabeth and her characterizations, but every single character. I could tell immediately who she was playing just based on the inflections in their voice, just based on their motives, how she made them each obviously individual, and I just think that Emily Ellett did a wonderful job as the narrator. There was a significant line between good and bad. That was one of the themes in this book, because Elizabeth starts off believing that pretty much all magic is evil, believing that sorcerers are just bad, no good, and it is her job to defend the people of Ostamere from the dangers, or at least the libraries in Ostamere, from the dangers of sorcerers. It was really interesting watching Elizabeth's worldview change and ebb and expand as she is exposed to other things, because growing up, she was only exposed to the library. She had really not been much of anywhere else other than maybe a local marketplace, but she had never been to like London or I think it's London, maybe it's just Ostamere. I got the feeling that it was definitely a 19th century London. I just can't remember right off to the top of my head if they ever enter London specifically, but just for the sake of this video, I'm going to continue to call it London. The relationships in this book were exceptionally well handled. I loved seeing the relationships develop between Elizabeth and not only Nathaniel Thorne, but also with Silas, his demon. Their relationship was one of my favorite to read about. And even one of her very dear friends from the library. We don't get to see her as often, but the scenes in which we do are just gold and wonderful and endearing. Speaking of relationships and characters, I'd now like to go ahead and just briefly discuss every single character and the things that I noticed about them, things that I liked, and so forth. Elizabeth Scrivener was an adorable, spunky, brave, intelligent, but also naive and curious 16-year-old girl who always ends up getting herself in the craziest of situations, and I believe a lot of that had to do with her curiosity, with the fact that she wants to know things, which is very admirable to me. Some people might say that at times Elizabeth was potentially not necessarily annoying, but maybe frustrating because she did ask a lot of questions, but at the same time, she was, again, a very sheltered 16-year-old girl who only grew up alongside dangerous books. Of course, her view of magic and sorcerers is going to be skewed. It would be, I think, unfair to expect otherwise of her character. But she rose above every challenge that she was given, and she really did become a hero by the end of the book. So she's definitely a female protagonist I can root for. Nathaniel Thorne was definitely amazing. He was snarky, sarcastic, but he was also a charmer, and you could tell that he was intrigued by Elizabeth and liked her almost instantly. Unfortunately, Elizabeth didn't exactly read Nathaniel the way that the reader is supposed to, but I guess that's just the beauty of a love story, is the reader knowing one thing and the characters knowing another, and just watching it all unfold. Nathaniel is extremely independent. He is also definitely reclusive. He has a bit of a tragic past. There's a bit of darkness about him as well that you can't quite pinpoint. Again, he was just a great character. I loved the relationship he had with Elizabeth as it developed. This was definitely more of a slow burn kind of romance, and I'm going to go ahead and say that there really aren't any explicit or adult scenes whatsoever. So, if you are uncomfortable with romance in books, I can promise that the level of this is no different than maybe like a show designated for young adults. Silas was really dynamic and probably one of my favorite characters that I've read about in a while. He was extremely morally gray and more towards the dark gray spectrum. Obviously, Silas is a demon. So, of course, his morals, if he has any, are going to be a little bit different than the average mortals. He was sophisticated. He acted more or less as Nathaniel's caretaker, as Nathaniel lives alone. He's a sorcerer. I believe he's 18. I think he's only maybe like a year or two older than Elizabeth. And Silas is more or less his housekeeper and his caretaker, the person that Nathaniel needs, basically. And he, as I mentioned, is kind of stuffy. He's very formal. He's very put together, and he makes sure that everything runs smoothly in Nathaniel Thorne's house. There were times when you questioned whether the characters could trust Silas, of course, because that's kind of the point of his character, but I will just leave it up to you to determine in the end whether he's trustworthy or not. The characters that I guess are good or at least neutral, I'll go ahead and mention one of Elizabeth's friends. I unfortunately cannot remember her name to save my life, but she was precious. Definitely a engineering science nerd. She was always interested in trying out some new experiments, some new theory, and she definitely ended up helping Elizabeth along the way and figuring out the conspiracies, figuring out the mystery that lies in the attack of the library. I think that's something I forgot to mention. Not only does the library where Elizabeth is in get attacked, and she gets wrongly accused of that, but other libraries are being attacked in this book, in this world. I believe there's like at least 5 or 6 major libraries in this setting, and Elizabeth is just trying to prevent that happening and occurring from other libraries in Ostamere. And because of her friend, they're able to accomplish, the goals that they put in place. And I'm going to just touch briefly on the villain. I'm not going to name them because that would be a major spoiler, but the villain was really dynamic as well. They definitely had passion, and you could I personally could relate to that passion and that drive to see a better world, but their motives, of course, and the logic that went into this passion were not a great balance. They didn't coincide, I guess I should say. But because of his passions and because of how unique this villain was, I definitely appreciated their character, and I liked reading about them because of that passion factor in them. Okay, so overall, that is my general idea, general consensus of the plot. I gave this 5 stars. If I haven't mentioned that already, it was definitely a favorite book so far of 2021, and most definitely a favorite read of this most recent quarter. I look forward to discussing a few other books that I'm reading right now. I'm reading the second book in the Curse So Dark and Lonely series, A Heart So Fierce and Broken, which follows mostly the story of Gray and a new character that is introduced. I also am, of course, still reading Clockwork Angel, which is part of the, not the Mortal Instruments, but the Infernal Devices series from Cassandra Clare, and I promise the next video I do for the Mortal Instruments, which was City of Glass, I promise I will just create a list of, how to read these in order. I'm going to try and figure out how to list these in video format, and if worse comes to worse, I'll just read them out loud. I did try to read and finish Get a Life, Chloe Brown. Unfortunately, it just was not the kind of read for me for at least a few reasons. I did get about halfway through and went ahead and rated it. I will be eventually discussing that book as well. However, instead of creating an entire video about it because I didn't finish, I will probably just briefly discuss it in next week's video when I discuss City of Glass with you. Thanks so much again for coming and watching my videos, showing me support, giving me ideas for what to read next. You guys are what keep me doing these videos, and I thank you so much for that. I hope you have a wonderful Friday. Bye-bye.